Literature and writing was very significant in my household growing up. We were encouraged, me and my brother, to absorb as much literature and writing as we could. Of course, I initially was more drawn to it than my brother at the time. One of the most notable playwrights that we were introduced to as children, of course, was William Shakespeare. And with the monumental works that he did, there is a tale told, a story that was so powerful that it has lasted for generations. The story, of course, Romeo and Juliet, and this love affair, tragically, that resulted in both of their premature deaths. But it told not only the story of their love, but it also told the conflict that existed with their families. Juliet being from the Capulet family, and of course Romeo coming from the Montague family, and how these families were at war, feudal war with each other for many years. And who would have guessed that the daughter of the head of the Capulet family and the son of the head of the Montague family would find love with one another? This is Brother Heath L. coming to you from the Griot's Corner, doing a classic film review, sort of classic in its application, but also a modern adaptation entitled West Side Story. And so I want you to come along and join with me as we explore the nuances of this story. Again, West Side Story is an adaptation of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, showing warring factions or warring families. In this case, within West Side Story, originally released on Broadway in 1957, subsequently was adapted into an award-winning, powerful film in 1961, starring, of course, the late Natalie Wood and Richard Beymer, Russ Tamblyn, George Chakiris. It was just a monumental cast, and of course Rita Moreno, who not only starred as Anita in the 1961 film version, but also Steven Spielberg and his artistry wrote a character, Valentina, that Rita Moreno came and she also starred in the 2021 West Side Story version. And so when we look at this story, again, within the context of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the warring families here were the Capulets and the Montagues. Within West Side Story, it was family, but it was family more. They played with the idea of two distinct gangs. Of course, the Jets, that was the white young men who lived in New York during this time. Of course, all of this was set in the late 50s, early 60s, and even when Steven Spielberg did another version of West Side Story, he still kept the setting of the time period the same. Of course, Tony, who along with Riff had founded the Jets. Tony had some life experiences where he was now seeking something more, doing something different. And so he decided to no longer frequent himself as he once had with the Jets. Of course, Riff, who is Jet through and through, has him and the Jets have an issue with the Puerto Ricans, who have not only come into the neighborhood, but they've developed their own gang called the Sharks, which of course was led by Bernardo. Bernardo and his family, and of course other Puerto Rican families, had moved into this section that was close by where the Jets were. They called themselves the Sharks. Bernardo had a protective covering and care for his younger sister Maria, who had never really experienced life fully and she was coming into her young womanhood, and he wanted to make sure that Maria would be protected. And so his girlfriend, Anita, also from Puerto Rico, did what she could to sort of be I guess you could say, a big sisterly influence for Maria. And again, if you've never seen the West Side Story film, just a brief overview. There is a dance. Well, first the Jets and the Sharks have a conflict, which is the opening of both of the films, that there's a conflict that you can see that exists between the Jets and the Sharks. Neither one of these games are receptive of the other. And there is a dance that they're going to have, an up-and-coming dance. And so Riff decides that it's going to be at the dance that he's going to approach Bernardo and challenge him, present a challenge for the Sharks and the Jets to have a conflict, a battle, a war, if you will. Just so happens Riff goes to Tony. Tony is really not interested in going to the dance in both films. Within the 1961 film, he just wasn't interested. In the 2021 film, not only was he not interested, but they sort of wrote into this that Tony was on probation. He was on probation because he had almost killed a young man in a gang fight. So he was really trying to turn his life around, working at this convenience store in the 2021 version, which was owned by Valentina. And in the 1961 version, it was the store, and they called the owner Pops. And so Pops was running that store. And so Riff is trying to really convince Tony to come to this dance. And Tony, of course, understands that there's something that he feels is coming. He just didn't know what it was. And of course, the beautiful song "Who Knows" that he begins singing, and he goes to the dance. And in the dance, the conductor, I would say the director of the dance, is realizing that there is a mixture of whites and Puerto Ricans. And so he's attempting to bring them together, and doesn't quite work. And they end up having a dance battle initially. And of course, Tony walks in, and in the midst of watching the dance, he catches her eye. He looks at Maria. Maria looks at him. And literally time stops. And they approach one another, not even realizing, nor really wasn't even realizing that they were from two warring factions, but they found one another in this way. And so subsequently, this film and this story, as you know, the Romeo and Juliet story, which is sort of, it patterns itself after, you see the tension that erupts between the Jets and the Sharks. Of course, neither the Jets are not, Riff and them are not happy about necessarily Tony finding this newfound love with this Puerto Rican girl who is the sister of the leader of the Sharks, Maria. They're not caring about that. And of course, Bernardo, being extremely protective of Maria, does not want her engagement or involvement with what he called this white Polak. But yet it could not stop the love that they had for one another. In short, there were some significant losses in this movie with the subsequent deaths of Bernardo as well as Riff. Won't go into, if you've never seen it, I don't really want to give it all away, but there were some significant losses. But this is really what I wanted to discuss regarding West Side Story and the whole concept of how love can be found within warring factions. That in the midst of these two families, of course, in the original Romeo and Juliet, these two families, but also families in the West Side Story versions, from the 57 Broadway version to the 61 adaptation film to the 2021. And of course, they've had a number of redos of the West Side Story musical. But ultimately, it comes down to the tension and the bitterness that existed between these two families. Of course, again, we mentioned Richard Beymer, who starred as Tony in the 1961 version, Ansel Elgort, who stars as Tony in the 2021 version, Natalie Wood, the late great Natalie Wood, who starred as Maria in the 61 version, Rachel Zegler, newcomer, had never done a film before. She was new on the block, who starred as Maria in the 2021 version, Rita Moreno. And I guess I fell in love as a boy with the character of Anita, much more so than, I mean, you would think when you have fallen in love with Maria, no, there was something about Rita Moreno's portrayal of Anita and how she portrayed her, and it was just so it just turned a young boy on. I'll just leave it at that. Subsequently, as many of you know, Rita Moreno went on to win the Best Supporting Actress for her role as Maria. And then Ariana DeBose in the 2021 version, who did an outstanding portrayal of Anita. And what I loved about her portrayal, she didn't try to mimic what Rita Moreno did. She embodied Anita in a whole new perspective for herself. And as a result of what she did in her portrayal as Anita, she also was nominated and won the Best Supporting Actress award in her portrayal as Anita. Again, significant performances from George Chakiris in the 1961 version as Bernardo, and David Alvarez, who Bernardo is, and I love how Steven Spielberg sort of gave a little bit more dimension to the characters, because in the 2021 version, Bernardo is a boxer. And so that is sort of brought out as well. Russ Tamblyn, how can we can't talk about one of the most memorable performances. And of course, Russ Tamblyn starred in a lot of musicals during the 50s and the 60s, but definitely, for at least for me, I'll say his most notable and memorable role is as Riff in the 1961 film adaptation of West Side Story. And Mike Feist, who captured Riff in a whole nother dimension as well in the 2021 version. I love the way that even though there were some things that were similar in terms of the story itself, the characters, of course, but the dimensions of them, I love the way Steven Spielberg added some layers to these characters, that we got a chance to really see a nuance and a different insight into who these characters are. But I had to lift up the performances because they were awesome. I'm for one am a little bit more biased to the 1961 version. Maybe it was because, and I say it based on the choreography. Jerome Robbins was a master choreographer, and I take nothing away from the choreographed performances that was done in the 2021 version, but there's something unique and more slick, something more, I don't know, I really can't explain it, more rhythmic and more, it was something more powerful about the 1961 choreographed portrayals. My favorite scene in the movie, of course, is when they do the song America. And the Puerto Rican women and the Puerto Rican men have this back and forth over being in America, and the rooftop scene. And again, not taking nothing away from how Spielberg brought that scene out from the top of the complexes into the street. I loved how he did it, but there was something about that exchange on the rooftop. And I guess maybe it's because I first saw West Side Story as a boy, of course, the 1961 version. Both movies are incredible. But again, just looking at the nuance of the story, and this is really what I feel is necessary to be brought out, as not only a look at the film itself, but also looking at the broader cultural context that we are all living in 2022. These warring factions, these warring families, because we are so conditioned in our society to find what divides us. That's easy. And we create our own monuments of fear and anger and, sort of attack and defense against those who are different, who may speak differently, who may have different cultural values. And summarily, it is sort of promoted in this American cultural dynamic where there's always this notion of you needing to pick a side. You need to choose a side. And here we find in the context of our cultural engagement, even in 2022, going back to how Shakespeare captured this divide within these families, how it is again recaptured in both versions of West Side Story, though two gangs, but yet families. There were still cultural differences that was present, and how Tony and Maria, particularly in the song "Somewhere," and I've mentioned this to someone that though I enjoyed Rita Moreno as Valentina, I enjoyed her role. I did not think her singing the song "Somewhere" was Valentina's song. For me personally, "Somewhere" is Tony and Maria, because they were dealing with the heated resistance and conflicts in their own families. And so they came to the conclusion that there's a place for us somewhere, a place for us, a place where we don't have to worry about what, from Maria's perspective, what Bernardo is going to think or say, and Tony not having to worry about what is going to come up with Riff or his fellow brothers in the Jets, what they were going to say. We were going to be able to be free to love one another. And interestingly, I look at how fate, and we'll just use God in this, bring the God contextually into this. As fate would have it, these two warring families would find love within the most inconspicuous ones within that family. Who would have imagined that Bernardo's sister, and he was a staunch Puerto Rican, head of the Sharks, and he despised the Jets. He despised Riff. He despised that whole white culture that he was experiencing, of course, discrimination and bigotry and all of that. And now I got to worry about, I'm dealing with that anyway. Now I got to worry about these white guys. I can't even walk down the street without being accosted by one of them. And then on the side of the Jets, Riff and Tony founded the Jets. And yet, in the midst of them founding the Jets, and of course, Tony was right by Riff's side, and they did what they did with the Jets. And yet, Tony was looking for something more, and he finds it with this young, beautiful Puerto Rican girl named Maria. And they find love. But yet, their love wasn't strong enough to keep the tensions within these two warring factions. It wasn't strong enough to keep them from coming together and exploding. And that's what ended up happening. And there's a scene, the 1961 version captures it. And this is a disclaimer, so if you haven't seen West Side Story, I hope this doesn't spoil it too much for you. But of course, dealing with the Romeo and Juliet motif, Tony ends up losing his life. The 1961 version, and they showed it a little bit more. They did it in the 2021 version. Spielberg captured it somewhat, but it was something, it was, again, more impactful for me how they did it, how it was done in the 1961 version. The members of the Jets go to pick up Tony to carry him, and they're struggling with him. And as they're about to slip with him, members of the Sharks come over and they hoist him up on the other side and they carry him off together. And what I got from that was it took his death for them to finally see that they share a commonality. Just them carrying, they didn't have a discussion. There weren't any words to be said, but just having the Jets carry Tony on one side and the sharks carrying him on the other side. And Spielberg sort of captured it similar within the 2021 version, but the cameras were a little bit more up on the actors in the 61 version, and capturing how impactful that was, because in the 61 version, when the sharks come over to grab the other side of Tony, they both look at each other. The Jets and the Sharks, they look at each other. And it was almost as if they now saw one another for the first time. They now saw each other for the first time. The beautiful impassioned speech that Natalie Wood gave as Maria in the 61 version, when she talked about how now she was filled with hate, and how that hate had killed her brother, had killed Riff, and now killed Tony, and how she was considering suicide or considering dying because the loves of her life, her brother Bernardo, but of course her love Tony, were now dead because of the unwillingness, not the inability, but the unwillingness to find commonality. I know this is supposed to be a classic film review, and it is, but I do hope, the one thing I do love about art and literature is that there are a lot of stories that are told that does speak to the consciousness and speak to the climate of the society that we presently live in. And because even now, for the great Steven Spielberg to want to even tackle, it was monumental for him to even want to tackle and do another film adaptation of such a classic film, West Side Story. They stand out distinctively on their own, but they both give us that same message, that same reminder of how differences can be worked out, and how really Tony and Maria were their examples. Their love could have been the catalyst to ease the cultural tensions and differences. But sometimes some lessons that we learn in life, sometimes they're learned through tragic consequences. And that is what happens here in West Side Story. It is by far, if anyone were to ask me, one of my top films of all time. And again, I do love the 2021 version. I don't want you to get that impression that I'm not appreciative of what Steven Spielberg did, because it was remarkable. It's a remarkable film. I give it, hands up. It gets well up, 2 thumbs up from me. If I were to borrow the Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel format of how they used to do film, they both get 2 thumbs up. But the 1961 version of West Side Story, and that story, that film, it's one of my favorites. And I think if we would just, and I'm speaking to everyone who's listening, if we would just take a moment when we find ourselves engaged in any kind of conflict, any kind of disagreement that results in sometimes voices being raised, terminology being utilized, or God forbid, if something physical, a physical interaction results, that we would take a lesson from Tony and Maria. And I'm not talking about falling in love with your opposer. I'm not talking about that. But I am talking about pausing for a minute to see, I know clearly where we disagree. Is it possible for us to learn something from one another and find where we have agreement, where there is commonality, where we can have balance, and maybe in some sense a true expression of genuine love? Can we find that? Can we come to that? I hope one day maybe we can. This is Brother Heath Ale from the Griot's Corner. Classic film review, West Side Story. If you've seen it years ago, haven't seen it in a while, not only check out the 1961 version, but check out the 2021 adaptation. Beautiful story. Most profound lessons of life found in this story. And in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Of course, there have been many films that have been done with that motif. Or one of my favorites is the one that was done in 1996 with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. It was called Romeo and Juliet, but it was modernized. Beautiful, beautiful film. But just that story of those warring families and how, don't you think it's time that we lay aside a lot of our differences? Yeah, stand where you stand on whatever your point is, whatever your goal or objective is, but also try to find, where can we find agreement if we can? I think we can, if we would only try. Peace and blessings. Griot's Corner, Brother Heath Ale, West Side Story.